towards the end of World War II, many Arab leaders were looking at what a post-war world would be like, and the possibility of Arab unity. In fact, the British had even put forward the idea in 1941, with Anthony Eden saying, "It seems to me both natural and right that the cultural and economic ties between Arab countries, yes, and the political ties too, should be strengthened. His Majesty's government, for their part, will give their full support to any scheme." But the British and many Arab leaders had conflicting plans. Churchill, for instance, said to Eden, "We should try to raise Ibn Saud to a general overlordship of Iraq and Transjordan." Eden, though, continued to believe in a federation which would include some sort of Jewish state. Ibn Saud, meanwhile, had lost his trusted British advisor, St. John Philby. Ben-Gurion, the future Israeli leader, even met Philby in 1937, and allegedly said, "Properly managed, Mr. Philby's scheme offers an approach which should not be abandoned." This plan that they speak of would have seen Zionists become part of a larger confederation headed by Ibn Saud. But also, Palestine should become home for all refugees, not just Jewish, and it could well have seen the deportation of all Arabs from Palestine in exchange. Philby, though, ran for Parliament for the fascist British People's Party and was arrested for being a suspected traitor. Otherwise, Harold McMichael, the High Commissioner for Palestine, also believed the British, French and Americans should almost share responsibility for the region initially, but claimed the division of Syria was unnatural and therefore also pushed for a federation. Or H.A.R. Gibbs said, before entering a union, the whole region should be broken up into equal parts like Basra and Damascus to make sure that they were all equal, and the various royals of the Middle East would all get their own little state. Abdullah of Jordan was quick to champion his own claims to take over a unified Syria in late 1942, while also pushing for a union with Iraq. But in Iraq, Prime Minister Nouri was coming up with his own plans. He believed that Arabs needed to unite to recreate their ancient glory and to progress in the path of civilization in freedom and peace. He sent a report to the British detailing his plans for Arab unity in the Blue Book, which included a federation of a Greater Syria and Iraq. This plan was also sent out to the leaders of neighbouring Arab states, and they agreed to meet in Alexandria in 1944. However, Ibn Saud wrote to the British complaining of Nouri's plans to place an Iraqi region, Abd al-Ilah, on the throne of Syria, while Abdullah of Jordan tried to move the Congress to Amman in order to push for his own claims. But it was the Egyptians that were able to take over the Congress, and here Mustafa al-Nahas was the Prime Minister. He had come back to power after the Abdeen Palace incident of 1942, and by most reports, he was a pretty poor and corrupt leader. For instance, the US ambassador said, "His ignorance is as colossal as it is appalling," yet argued, "We can get anything which we want from him if we are willing to pay for it." Nahas, though, managed to take over the cause of Arab unity and push forward an Egyptian version of the Arab League. After all, Egypt had not been mentioned in any of these plans, but a unified Syria and Iraq on his doorstep would have reduced Egypt's prestige internationally. So, in the Alexandria Protocol, they agreed that Lebanon should remain independent and that all members should defend the rights of the Palestinians. The League was also formed of independent Arab states represented on an equal footing, and their goal was to protect their independence and sovereignty against every aggression by suitable means. This, however, was pretty disastrous to the idea of Arab unity. Nahas had managed to end the possibility of Nouri, Abdullah or Ibn Saud realizing their plans for a large unified Arab state, and thus it put Egypt at the center of the Arab League, which was founded the next year, while the other states remained divided and contending for power. Nahas, though, wouldn't last too long afterwards. Miles Lamson, the British ambassador, had put him in power and largely kept him there, as he continued to despise King Farouk. In fact, Lamson even once discussed removing Farouk from power, but everyone ignored this. King Farouk, on the other hand, believed that Nahas had too much power, and while Lamson was away, had him removed in late 1944. In early 45, Farouk then met with Roosevelt on the USS Quincy, and along with Churchill, Roosevelt told Farouk to make reforms, as nowhere in the world were the conditions of extreme wealth and extreme poverty so glaring. Then the Allies encouraged Farouk to formally declare war on the Axis in order to gain a seat at the United Nations. This though was an incredibly unpopular decision, and the new Prime Minister Mahir was assassinated by a member of the fascist Young Egypt Society after delivering the news. Mahmoud al-Nokrashi Pasha replaced him, and fortunately for him, he was met with new ambassadors. This is because over in Britain, Churchill was voted out of power, and the Labour Party were far less colonial and wanted to improve relations with Egypt, so even removed Lamson from the country. Nokrashi was replaced for a while by the former dictator Sidki, and he tried to solve the major issue of Sudan, which was still under joint Anglo-Egyptian control. But he failed to get British approval for full annexation, and thus resigned, and Nokrashi was brought back in. At the same time, the Zionist movement was gaining more allies in the world, as the Soviet Union joined America in supporting the cause. Ivan Maysky, the Deputy Foreign Minister of the Soviet Union, visited Palestine in 1943, and there he saw the kibbutz and many labour organisations. He therefore began to believe that Zionism represented a progressive trend in contrast to the reactionary Arab neighbours. Yet on the other end of the political spectrum though, there were still the revisionist paramilitaries. Here Menachem Begin, the leader of Irgun, and Yitzhak Shamir, the leader of Lehi, began to coordinate with each other against the British. Begin had studied the Irish War of Independence and believed that a guerrilla war was the best way to humiliate the British, create sympathy for his cause, and ultimately chase the British out. In February 1944, they began their revolt by bombing the offices of the Immigration Department, the department which had stopped Jewish refugees from entering Palestine. Leahy then joined in by shooting policemen and the British resident minister. This all could have ended the Zionist cause and turned public opinion against them. So Ben-Gurion and the more moderate paramilitary, the Haganah, joined the British on what was called the hunting season. In short, the much larger paramilitary began to attack the revisionists throughout the year. Begin, however, refused to fight back, believing rightfully that a degree of restraint would gain him favour in the country. So while Haganah were successful, they were seen as collaborators, targeting their fellow Jews. This fight continued until 1945, when even the moderates became aware that the British were not going to give them a state at the end of the conflict, so the two Jewish sides began to cooperate. The Nazis and the Mufti, meanwhile, made one final play to take Palestine, with Operation Atlas. A few German soldiers were sent to parachute in with weapons and start a rebellion. This force included some who had been part of the German Christian Templar Society that had established colonies there decades ago, as well as Arabs like Hassan Salama. His son, by the way, was Ali Hassan Salama, who was Chief of Operations of Black September, a group responsible for many hijackings, assassinations, and the Munich Olympics massacre. The members of Operation Atlas, however, were quickly arrested. In later history, Israeli historians have claimed that their plan was to poison the water supply of Tel Aviv and kill 250,000 people, but there's no great evidence for this. Elsewhere, just before the war ended in Turkey, Inonu made serious moves to align himself with the Allies. This is because the Soviets were already pushing on Berlin, and he was worried that they would turn onto Turkey next. So he declared war on the Axis in early 45 and was welcomed into the UN. But possibly more important, within his country he arrested the pan-Turkist and Axis supporter Nahal Atsiz, along with many of his supporters. All of them were accused of racism and treason, but really this was just a move to further improve relations with the Allies. Many were also later released, as it was argued. Many of their views in favour of Turkish identity were not opposed to the constitution of the country, and the pan-Turkish movement continued to grow. Inonu would soon even allow for the people to vote in the first multi-party elections shortly after the war, sensing that political upheaval would be inevitable. One of the causes for such rifts came from a controversial land bill, which would have redistributed land to farmers. This angered many politicians who themselves owned land, and they were joined by politicians who opposed such a status policy, and the government's mishandling of the economy thus far. So, under the likes of Celal Bayar, they founded the Democrat Party. They ran against Inonu in 46, but lost in a landslide, possibly in a fraudulent election. And it should also be said that Inonu began to backtrack on many of his policies, some of which may appear almost Maoist. Like in 1939, he had created People's Rooms, which were community centres aimed at promoting Kemalism and in order to provide an education to many people in the countryside. These had helped educate tens of thousands of people, but there was a growing sense of anti-communism, and soon they would all be shut down. Otherwise, Ibn Saud in Saudi Arabia also recognised the importance of a foreign ally in the post-war world, and for that he turned to America. They already had oil concessions in his country, while Roosevelt argued the defence of Saudi Arabia is vital to the defence of the United States. The two met in early 1945, and there Ibn Saud agreed that America could use Saudi airspace. Yet, while discussing Palestine, Ibn Saud argued that the Jews should be given living space in the Axis countries which oppressed them. The war in Europe, though, ended that May, and while Europe was divided, the Islamic world was left almost in limbo. For starters, the Syrians had been promised their independence, but the French still hadn't left, despite many protests. They also watched on in worry as France began to reassert their colonial position over in Algeria. There, Ferhat Abbas's party of nationalists had continued to grow, and thousands protested for more rights and independence. Then on May 8th, as people celebrated the end of the war in the towns of Sétif and Guelma, they clashed with the French settlers. Violence in the two towns spiraled out of control, so the army was called in, and along with legionnaires, Moroccans and Senegalese, they carried out a number of executions. Many villages were then bombed, and settlers lynched the prisoners. In the end, it's believed up to 20 to 30,000 Muslims were killed, although this number is disputed. General Henri Martin correctly predicted that the violence wouldn't end here. "I have secured you peace for 10 years. If France does nothing, it will happen again. Only next time it will be worse and maybe irreparable." So, over in Syria, when de Gaulle planned on establishing a naval and airbase in the country, the protests intensified. More protests left French soldiers dead, and the violence spread. This resulted in possibly one of the more odd events of the period, called the Levant Crisis. The French brought in more troops, killed many in Hama, and then even shelled Damascus. They even broke into the Syrian parliament, hoping to arrest al-Kuwatli, but he managed to escape. Senegalese troops in particular committed a number of atrocities, looting and dumping bodies in mass graves. French officers like Paul Baynet summed up the situation saying, "The Damascus abscess must be lanced." Yet Kuwatli and the Syrians found an ally in Churchill. He already didn't like de Gaulle, arguing that he was one of the greatest dangers to European peace. While even Truman, the new US president, said, "Those French ought to be taken out and castrated." So when the French refused to stop, Churchill, who was just about to lose his position as Prime Minister, ordered the British Army in, almost starting another war. The French army in Syria was already in a weak state, as many of the Arabs had abandoned them, forcing them all to surrender without a fight. De Gaulle said, "We are not in a position to wage war against you, but you have betrayed France and betrayed the West. That cannot be forgotten." He believed that this was all part of a British plan to take over the countries. However, Kuwatli was brought back in, and their independence was finally recognised. Nearby, the British continued to make it apparent that they would not grant the Jews a state. So the Haganah Lehi and Irgun launched joint attacks for the next 10 months. For instance, November 1st, 1945 was dubbed the Night of the Trains, as they attacked railway lines and stations. Or June 16th, 1946 was the Night of the Bridges. Through Operation Agatha in June 1946, the British were able to arrest many leaders, including Moshe Sharrat, who would soon be Prime Minister. But the Jewish paramilitaries would launch their most infamous attack on the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, where they killed 91 people. Bernard Montgomery declared that the British were facing a cruel, fanatical and cunning enemy, and there was no way of knowing who was friend and who foe. General Evelyn Barker, however, caused further resentment as he banned all of his troops from visiting Jewish businesses, infamously saying, "They will be punishing the Jews in a way the race dislikes as much as any by striking at their pockets and showing our contempt of them." However, all of this came shortly after the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry had published a plan for the future of the region. Truman was already keen to send 100,000 Holocaust survivors to Palestine, while Britain's Clement Attlee wanted joint responsibility for the region and an inquiry before any resettlement. They interviewed a number of people, including Holocaust survivors, who overwhelmingly preferred to be settled in Palestine. While one member of the committee, Frank Adelot, said, "I left Washington pretty strongly anti-Zionist. But when you see at first hand what these Jews have done in Palestine, the Arabs are not equal to anything like it, and would destroy all that the Jews have done." So with this sort of mentality, the committee recommended that 100,000 Jews immediately be sent to Palestine, while other countries should help rehome the other Jewish victims. So with this mentality, they recommended 100,000 Jews should immediately enter Palestine, while other countries should help rehome the remaining Jewish victims. Also, Palestine should not be a Jewish nor an Arab state, and any future government should protect all faiths. Obviously, much of the Jewish-owned land would become part of a Jewish state, and it should be said that a great deal of this land had been purchased for decades, even during the days of the Ottoman Empire. King Abdullah of Jordan even said, "The Arabs are as prodigal in selling their land as they are in weeping about it." However, to end the violence, they agreed that the UN should take over the mandate. The UN would then work to improve the standard of living and the economic power of the Palestinian Arabs. But they knew neighbouring Arab states would fund more violence, and the Jewish paramilitaries wouldn't stop their attacks either. For this, the British demanded that the Americans help out in quelling any other uprisings. There were, by the way, a couple other plans that were put forward, like the Morrison-Grady plan, which allowed the communities to exercise self-rule under British oversight, while Jerusalem and Negev would remain fully British, and the Bevan plan, which wanted to expand UN trusteeship for 5 more years, and then create an assembly of Jews and Muslims to rule. But these two plans were rejected by both groups. At the same time, many Jews were fleeing to Palestine illegally. The British stopped thousands of them from entering and interned them in camps on Cyprus, while in Palestine, the Jews had actually managed to expand their lands incredibly quickly by establishing 11 new settlements in Negev in just one night in October. The Allies, though, were still convinced that there was a solution, despite the recent Jewish violence and hotel bombings. Ben-Gurion, eager to keep the world on side, condemned the attack, saying Irgun were the enemy of the Jewish people. However, in private, Weizmann reportedly said, "I can't help feeling proud of our boys." The Haganah instead just refocused their efforts on bringing in illegal immigrants, while the Irgun and Lehi continued their attacks on the British. Like in December 1946, on the night of the beatings, they kidnapped and flogged British soldiers. And in July 1947, the Sergeant's Affair saw them capture British soldiers and hang them. In retaliation, British troops killed Jews in Tel Aviv, and in British cities, people attacked Jewish businesses and synagogues. It should also be said that anti-Semitic attacks grew across the Islamic world. Like in Egypt, the Young Egypt Party and Muslim Brotherhood organized demonstrations, violence broke out, and 5 Jews were killed. Or in Tripolitania, which was still under British control, rioters left 4,000 Jews homeless. But these were about to intensify across the Islamic world in 1947, as the British Parliament voted to hand Palestine over to the UN, and they, in turn, passed a resolution agreeing to partition the country. But before getting onto that, I should mention developments elsewhere, as the Soviet Union had been increasingly aggressive in the region. For starters, in Turkey in June 1945, they demanded the establishment of Soviet bases along the Straits. That year, newspapers like Pravda published articles arguing Georgians have earned the right to submit its rightful demands. We appeal to the world public opinion about ancient lands Turkey has seized from us. This was essentially the Soviet Union claiming land stretching all the way to Trabzon, and this obviously panicked the Turks. They would grow closer to the United States, and within a few years, they would even join NATO. The Soviets, on the other hand, were also looking to expand their domains into Iran as well. They had, after all, invaded during the war, but were not prepared to step away entirely. They instead created two puppet states in the north, the Republic of Mahabad and Azerbaijan. Mahabad was created in Kurdish lands and led by Qazi Muhammad. He had actually ruled the lands for a few years under Soviet occupation, having been a jurist and the leader of the Society for the Revival of Kurdistan. While in Iranian Azerbaijan, Jafar Pishavari founded the Democratic Party in Tabriz and pushed a pan-Turkist agenda. They implemented the usual socialist reforms like free education, but both the Kurds and Azeris were focused on promoting their own cultures and languages, something that the Soviet Union had long went against inside their own borders. And although some reforms may have been popular, land reforms and the dismantling of tribal powers simply angered too many locals. This then is when Mustafa Barzani came back into the picture to champion the Kurdish cause. After failed rebellions in Iraq, he fled across the border during the war and became the Minister of Defense of Mahabad. The Iranians, meanwhile, complained to the newly formed United Nations. Resolutions were passed to solve the Iran crisis, and they simply pressured the Soviets to withdraw. In all likelihood, the USSR had just completely overestimated their own position and support in the region, while underestimating the reaction of the United States. And this crisis was probably the first real incident that demonstrated the start of the Cold War. While the Soviets pulled out, the economies of the new states collapsed and the Iranians quickly moved in. They hanged Qazi Muhammad in the square and destroyed Kurdish books, while in Azerbaijan they assaulted many women and killed hundreds of people. Barzani and many others tried to fight on before fleeing to Iraq and then to the Soviet Union. While back in his native Iraq, the founding members of the Kurdish Democratic Party elected him as their new leader. Iran then began receiving a great deal of aid from the United States, and once again they survived partition. But in neighbouring Afghanistan, the country which had been at peace for some time comparatively was in turmoil once again. Back in the late 20s, Mohammad Nadir Shah had ended the civil war, but didn't, as expected, hand over power to the deposed Shah Amanullah. Within the country there were many who still supported the exiled king, including Mazrak, the chieftain of the Zadran. By 1944 though, Mohammad Nadir had died, and his young son Mohammad Zahir ruled Afghanistan. That year, Mazrak led the Zadran in open rebellion, starting yet another civil war. Mazrak would even try to invade the British Raj in 44, looking to unite with other Pashtuns, but he was quickly driven back. His father, by the way, was Babrak Khan, who had taken part in many rebellions before. There were, of course, a number of other listed causes of the war, including new conscription laws, heavy taxation, failing harvests, and a great deal more. As such, other tribes joined in, like the Safi and Mangal, who decided to elect their own king, a man named Salamai. They even tried to link up with a local hero of sorts, known as Fakir Ipi. He was a leader in Waziristan who had long fought against the British. And this move could have seen the creation of a brand new Pashtun state through the Banu Resolution. Remember, at this time the British were pulling out of India and set to partition the lands. The Pashtuns would be given a vote on whether to join India or Pakistan. The Banu Resolution, which was put forward to the British, hoped to give the Pashtuns a third option, the right to join another nation, Pashtunistan. The British, however, refused this, and the Afghan government began bombarding rebel positions, forcing them to surrender by late 1946. The government then proceeded to exile tribe members that had taken part, like the Safi, in what some have called a campaign of ethnic cleansing. The king, though, had remained in power, and with the British now gone, the great game had finally ended, but a new contest emerged. In 1947, the Indo-Pakistan War broke out, and this was something that Afghanistan would take advantage of. They had long voted against Pakistan joining the United Nations, and continued pushing for the creation of Pashtunistan, hoping to expand into it themselves. As such, there's many reports of Afghan agents working in Pashtun lands, distributing money and weapons to tribal leaders. In 1950, Pakistan even claimed that Afghan troops crossed into their country before being chased back. Then, going back to Mazrak, his brother actually assassinated Liaquat Ali Khan, the first Prime Minister of Pakistan. However, he was also killed in the attacks, so his motives have never been fully understood. Some believe it was the Soviets, or maybe even part of a Pakistani coup, or, of course, an Afghan mission. However, we will leave the partition of India here and go back to the Levant, where another partition was ongoing. Once the UN took over the mandate, they quickly dispatched a special committee to decide on exactly what to do once again. Yet, it should be said many like Norwegian Togve Lai, the first Secretary General of the UN, were keen on partitioning the country from the start. Also, the Arab Higher Committee refused to work with the UN members. But the Jewish councils launched a huge propaganda campaign, welcoming UN members with flowers and cheering crowds, and giving tours of their enterprises. The Jewish leadership had also reportedly bugged hotel rooms and sent out female agents to monitor the committee. While in some Arab settlements, the people were evacuated in order to stop anyone from working with the UN, or in the cases the UN did meet the Arabs, they were booed and hissed at. In the end, though, many members of the committee were appalled by the prevalence of child labour in Arab settlements, and really just the general poverty. Even the Iranian ambassador Entezam said, "What asses the Arabs are. The country is so beautiful and it can be developed. If they gave it all to the Jews, they would transform it into Europe." The committee then met with some Arab leaders as well, like Riyad al-Sal of Lebanon and Abdullah of Jordan. In the case of Abdullah, he had allegedly hinted that he should take over the Arab half of Palestine, while in Lebanon it was said in private that Maronite Christians accepted partition, but in public they spoke out against it. Regardless, the committee agreed to partition the lands according roughly to the populations. But Jews, who only made up 32% of the population, were given over 56% of the land. Then they agreed that an international zone would be made around Jerusalem. This was then brought to vote in the United Nations, where 72% of countries voted in favour, including France, the USSR and America. Britain, China and Yugoslavia abstained, while the Muslim world, India, Greece and Cuba voted against it. Of course, this caused outrage across the Middle East, and riots broke out almost everywhere. To give some examples, in Bahrain, crowds marched into the small Jewish quarters of Manama and ransacked shops and synagogues. In Aden, over 100 people were killed, mainly Jews, and in Aleppo, 75 Jewish people were killed. While in Palestine, violence had already flared up again. Bombs detonated across the country, rioting broke out, and both sides murdered one another. To contend against the Jewish paramilitaries, the Palestinians created the Army of the Holy War, led by Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini and Hassan Salama. The Mufti was above them all, but here he made a crucial mistake. One of his allies, Anwar Nusabeh, revealed that the Mufti was only willing to arm his loyal supporters, leaving his forces very, very small. However, this also brings me to a pretty controversial issue, and that's the ties between Nazi war criminals and the new Arab states. Egypt in particular became home to many Nazis, like Johann von Leers, who had converted to Islam and later became an advisor to General Nasser. He was joined in Egypt by potentially up to 6,000 other Nazis, like Otto Ernst Rehmer. He, for instance, claimed, "I know Mr. Arafat quite well. He invited me to eat at his headquarters. I know all his people. They wanted many things from us." And on Yasser Arafat, he was allegedly trained by Otto Skorzeny, an SS commander, who rescued Mussolini and tried to start rebellions in Iran. The FBI even reported one of the most perfidious Nazi agents seems to be the instigator of the recent pogroms in Cairo. Here, they are referring to Adolf Eichmann. Then there was also the head of the Gestapo in Poland, Leopold Gleim, Arthur Schmidt, a general in the Afrika Korps, and Bernhard Bender, who ran Jewish interrogation centers in Egypt in the 1950s. Possibly the most infamous in Cairo, though, was Aribert Haim, also known as Dr. Death. In Palestine, Dr. Herbert Pritzker worked alongside the Arabs and said of troops in Jaffa, "The Arab brigade in Jaffa consisted of 7 Germans, 150 Yugoslavs, 30 Egyptians, and 200 Lebanese and Syrians. There were very few Arabs among them." Or in Fawzi al-Kawakji's army, The Spiegel reported, "They are mainly former soldiers in Rommel's Afrika Korps, escapees from Egyptian POW camps, or Muslim Yugoslavs and Albanians, who Jerusalem's ex-Mufti had previously recruited to a pro-German Mufti brigade." The Spiegel also reported that when the Arabs surrendered in Haifa, the Jews demanded, among other things, the surrender of all Nazi Germans fighting. Many other nations also saw the value of these Nazi veterans. Syria, in fact, requested 8,000 Bosnians be transferred to their country, and Iraq asked for 2,500. But many of these German officers struggled in the Arab world, and the differences in training. Like General Major Oscar Munsell said, "1,000 times I've tried to beat into their dead heads that pretty paint and big identification numbers do not a fighting panzer force make." Bet Stolzheim, a naval officer dealing with the Egyptians, said, "Oriental sloppiness irritates me again and again, while here they just shake their heads about it, Malayish." But this brings me back to the army of the Holy War. They quickly blockaded Jerusalem, leading many to believe that the Jews would be easily defeated. However, once again, the Arab cause was split. Shukri al-Quwatli of Syria decided on building up his own force of volunteers, the Arab Salvation Army, to advance his own cause. Yet he knew his nation's army was not strong enough, so requested funding from other Arab states. It seemed though that war was imminent. As the Secretary General of Egypt, Azam Pasha, said, "I personally wish that the Jews do not drive us to this war, as this will be a war of extermination. I know that volunteers will be arriving to us as far as India, Afghanistan and China to win." Preparing for this, Ben-Gurion introduced conscription and began acquiring weapons. Fortunately for him, Soviet support allowed him to buy weapons from communist Czechoslovakia, while his agents continued to gather more arms from the huge stockpiles left in Europe after the war. With these, they launched Plan Dalet, a remarkably controversial plan, which was essentially ethnic cleansing. In this plan, he ordered the destruction of villages. In the event of resistance, the armed force must be destroyed and the population must be expelled outside the borders of the state. The Jews, also much like the Arabs, ignored the fact that Jerusalem was supposed to be placed under international control, and Operation Natshon in April 1948 was able to reopen the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem road and lift the siege. Also, in these campaigns they continued to commit atrocities, notably the Deir Yassin massacre. This was committed by the Irgun and Lehi paramilitaries, who captured the town after meeting some fierce resistance. They then proceeded to assault many women, kill around 100 people, and paraded prisoners in Jerusalem in front of cheering crowds. In response, the Arabs assaulted a medical convoy and killed around 80 people, mainly Jewish doctors and nurses. The Jewish advances and atrocities, as well as the death of Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini in combat, started yet another controversial point of the conflict: the mass exodus of Arab Palestinians. Almost nobody, however, agrees to why it happened. To try and put this into some sort of context, from 1931 to 47, the Jewish population had rose from 175,000 to 630,000. Yet they were still in the minority, as there were over 1 million Muslims. But by April 1948, already 100,000 Palestinians had fled their lands. Then, when Plan Dalet was launched, more were forcibly evicted, and around 200 villages were destroyed, and the massacres continued. For instance, in May alone, 70 were killed at Ain Zaytun, 200 at Tantura, and 70 more at Abu Shusha. The Arabs also committed massacres, like at Kfar Etzion, where 127 Jews were killed, also in May. All of this pushed more people to flee their homes. Historian Benny Morris has found most villages were depopulated after a Jewish attack. However, others claim that Arab leaders invited them to leave. For instance, John Bagot Glubb, commander of Jordan's Arab Legion, said, "Villages were frequently abandoned even before they were threatened by the progress of war." Or The Economist in 1948 reported on the Arabs fleeing Haifa, "There is but little doubt that the most potent of the factors were the announcements made over the air by the higher Arab executive. The main reason behind such an order, if they gave such an order, was the belief that the Arabs would soon smash Israel and everybody could then return home. As Nouri al-Said of Iraq said, "We will smash the country with our guns and obliterate every place the Jews seek shelter in. The Arabs should conduct their wives and children to safe areas until the fighting has died down. Khalid al-Azam, the Syrian Prime Minister, later said of the refugee issue, "We are the ones who encouraged them to leave. Only a few months separated our call to them to leave and our appeal to the United Nations to resolve on their return." Regardless, 300,000 Arabs had left by May, around 1/3 of the population, and that month, the mandate formally ended and Ben-Gurion declared Israeli independence on the 14th. The very next day, the neighbouring Arab states invaded. The Haganah had around 35,000 men or so, with a small capacity to produce ammunition. On the other side, the Holy War Army only ever had 1,000 men, and the Liberation Army numbered around a few thousand. Both of these were also very poorly supplied. Yet now, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Egypt and Lebanon were coming to their aid, and on paper, this may seem like a lot. But the Saudis only ever sent 1,000 men, Yemen around 300, Lebanon 400, Iraq and Syria initially 2,000 each, Egypt 10,000 and Jordan the same. So really most of these combatants only ever provided very little. And in the case of Egypt, corruption at the time was commonplace. In fact, Hussein Siri Amer, the commander of their forces, was accused of distributing faulty weapons to his men. The strongest Arab force at that time was the Arab Legion of Jordan, which had been trained by the British, although in 1946 the mandate was formally abolished and the Emirate of Transjordan became the Kingdom of Jordan. But King Abdullah had said before he did not intend to resist or impede the partition of Palestine and creation of a Jewish state. He was therefore more concerned about taking parts of Palestine for himself, and even met with Golda Meir before offering to create a Jewish state under his control. Allegedly, he said to the Israelis, "Why don't you wait a few years? I will take over the whole country and you will be represented in my parliament. I will treat you very well and there will be no war." Abdullah also had his disagreements with other Muslim leaders, like he accused King Farouk of Egypt of not really being an Arab at all. As he said, "You do not make a gentleman out of a Balkan farmer's son simply by making him a king." While in Egypt, Farouk didn't even tell his Prime Minister Nokrashi of his plans for war until just a couple days beforehand, even though Nokrashi had long advised against any action himself. But Farouk had provided sanctuary to the Mufti and was fearful of the growing Muslim Brotherhood. So, despite his womanizing and gambling, he began to appeal to the growing Islamist factions. Yet when war was declared, they did unite. Even Abdullah followed the other Arab nations and moved troops led by British officers like Glubb Pasha into Jerusalem, a city which he had long claimed, almost as compensation for his family losing Mecca. However, his forces never went into lands designated to the Jewish state. Farouk of Egypt, on the other hand, wished to take southern Palestine for himself. Nuri of Iraq still wanted all of the Fertile Crescent. In fact, nearly every leader had territorial ambitions on Palestine and did not want to see it become an independent state. Meanwhile, the Israelis got some support from the French, who joined the Czechs in supplying them with arms. And they found some allies in the region. Members of the Druze, Circassians, and even Bedouin communities defected and joined the Jewish forces. While on the other side, Christian Palestinians continued to side with the Muslim Arabs. In fact, these Christians had been some of the earliest and fiercest critics of Zionism. Like the Palestine paper was ran by the Christian El Issa family, and some have said that this paper was crucial in shaping a Palestinian identity. The Israelis, though, were welcoming in refugees at a rate of 10,000 a month, allowing their army to expand to 60,000 men. Then they were sort of saved by the UN, who declared a truce in June, allowing the Israelis to reorganize. However, Arab volunteers from even more countries, including Morocco and Sudan, also began to arrive. The truce then expired in July and the conflict began again. This period of fighting saw even more expulsions, notably in Lydda and Ramla. Here, Moshe Dayan would commit further massacres, and tens of thousands would be forced to leave their homes. Another truce was called shortly afterwards. The UN tried to make peace with another partition plan, but war resumed again in October. Through Operation Yoav, the Israelis were quickly able to push into Negev, while Operation Hiram chased the Arab forces out of Upper Galilee. The Arabs, on the other hand, remained divided. The Egyptians who had moved into Gaza created the All-Palestinian Protectorate, headed by the Mufti. Abdullah of Jordan refused to recognize them, and in December at the Jericho Conference, he named himself King of Arab Palestine, and ordered Glubb Pasha to disarm all Palestinians in the West Bank. Plus, the decision to appoint the Mufti in power lost the cause a great deal of credibility in the West. As the US stated, he could not be forgiven for his actions during the war. All of this Arab disunity allowed the Israelis to push them from Gaza and even to the Sinai Peninsula that December. The British, though, pressured them to retreat, and in fact nearly joined the war after the Israelis shot down British planes, believing them to be Egyptian. Yet no Arab nation stepped forward to aid the Egyptians, and they were forced to sue for peace in February. It should be mentioned, though, that they continue to have domestic issues. After Prime Minister Meir was assassinated in 1945, his successors began worrying about the Muslim Brotherhood, who maybe had around 500,000 members. The Prime Minister in 1948 was Nokrashi Pasha, and he outlawed the group. But the Brotherhood's leader, Banner, had sent off volunteers to Israel, and they continue to grow in popularity. Then, in retaliation of his crackdown, on December 28th, Nokrashi was assassinated by a member of the Brotherhood. The government in turn assassinated Banner himself in February 1949, hoping to end the issue. But the group just went underground, and they would eventually re-emerge. The Iraqi government was also not safe at home, as demonstrated by the Al-Watba uprising. This began when the monarchy began to discuss extending British concessions, like continuing their control over foreign affairs and military planning. This was signed by a new Prime Minister, Salih Jabir, the first Shiite to have the position. But he wouldn't last long, and Nouri came back into office. He, though, continued to work alongside the British, which may seem a little odd at first. But he was already having to deal with striking oil workers and a growing communist party. The British therefore secured his rule and the Iraqi monarchy. Yet many politicians had been kept out of discussions with the British, and they led protests alongside students and communists who were fighting against mass poverty and the strict class system. Throughout January 1948, the police shot up to 400 people, and martial law was declared to end the protests. The Communist Party of Iraq largely died out afterwards, thanks in part to the arrest and execution of their leaders, like Yusuf Salman Yusuf. But the Communists also lost support because they had followed the Soviet Union in accepting the partition of Palestine, losing them a great deal of support. Back to the war, though, the Egyptians agreed to a demarcation line, and for this they were allowed to keep control of Gaza. However, it should be stressed that this wasn't supposed to be a formal new border. Also, the Egyptians refused to open up the Suez Canal or even the Straits of Tiran to Israeli ships for a number of years. The withdrawal of Egyptian troops also allowed the Israelis to push into Eilat the next month and raise the Inc. flag. Iraq then withdrew their forces in March, while Lebanon signed another agreement the same month. The Jordanians made peace next. Abdullah was allowed to keep East Jerusalem and the West Bank in exchange for some territorial concessions. Then Syria finally made peace in July, however they too were having problems of their own. Al-Quwatli was still president at this point, but he was facing criticism for the conduct of the war. So too was the Kurdish army chief of staff, Husni al-Zaim. Well, Zaim in March 1949 decided to launch a coup and take power for himself. This was a quick, bloodless affair, and one that has become incredibly controversial. Some have speculated that the CIA were behind it, while the British at the time said that it may have been planned by Zaim for over 2 years prior. His actions after taking power, though, do suggest that he was perhaps too pro-Western. For instance, he quickly signed an armistice with Israel and then gave permission for the construction of the Trans-Arabian Pipeline, which had been championed by the Americans. He also freely offered to settle 300 Palestinians in his land, and as a secular leader, he planned on banning the veil and even the fez. However, on the other side, he had formed an alliance with the SSNP, the far-right group led by Antoun Saada. The plan initially was for Zaim to take power in Syria and Saada to go to Lebanon and thus unite the countries. However, Zaim betrayed Sadr by telling the Lebanese authorities about his plans, and they subsequently executed him. This move angered one of the generals responsible for the coup, Adib Shishkali. He had been a long-time ally of Sadr, and in turn, he led a counter-coup against Zaim and executed him. This coup would bring al-Atassi back to power, but these two leaders had different plans for Syria. Shishkali, like most in the SSMP, favoured a greater Syria, while the growing Ba'athist Party favoured Arab unity, and Atassi began to support for unification with Iraq. Atassi even began to meet with the Iraqi regent Abd al-Ilah and the young King Faisal II. This plan was even supported by Syrian prime ministers like Nazim al-Qudsi, so for a while, unification seemed very possible. However, Shishkali believed that this would see the Iraqis become dominant in his country. He therefore arrested many pro-Iraqi officers and helped topple Qudsi. Al-Atassi tried desperately to form a new government, but Shishkali continued to make demands on leaders. Like he wanted his right-hand man, Fawzi Selu, to become defense minister. So one prime minister who refused, al-Dawabdi, only served 1 day in office before there was another coup. Atassi resigned in protest, allowing Shishkali to take full military control of the country. Newspapers were closed down, political parties were banned, and spies were sent out across the country. Some of those that were exiled were the likes of Michael Aflaq, the founder of the Ba'athist Party, who began to plot against Shishkali from Lebanon. Atassi, on the other hand, was quickly imprisoned. This wouldn't be the only change in power in the region though, as in Lebanon they now had to deal with over 100,000 Palestinian refugees, while their government was incredibly corrupt. Here they used what was called the Zaim system. This allowed politicians to use bribes and force to stay in office, while notable families often remained powerful. For instance, Kamal Jumblat was a Druze whose family had held power for centuries, and he founded the Progressive Socialist Party in 1949. Many other families had their own parties, and at the head of it all was the long-serving president Bechara el-Khoury. He had previously taken power alongside allies like Kamil Shamoun, a Christian, and Riyad al-Sol, a Muslim, and together they agreed to divide power between the religions. Well, in 1949 they executed Anton Sadr, the leader of the fascistic SSMP, for planning on starting a coup. In response, the SSMP assassinated al-Sol, weakening el-Khoury's position. He was then forced to resign, charged with corruption, and replaced with Chamoun. The assassination of al-Sol, though, may well have been welcomed by King Abdullah of Jordan, as al-Sol had been a vocal supporter for the creation of the all-Palestinian government, something which of course would have impeded the king's plans to annex the West Bank for himself. Abdullah, though, was already growing unpopular for annexing the West Bank, and rumours began to spread that he was having secret talks with Israel. In July 1951, he visited Al-Aqsa Mosque and was shot by members of the Husseini family, the same family which the Mufti belonged to. This assassination created a succession crisis in the country. His eldest son Talal inherited the throne, but he had a strained relationship with his father, who often threatened to remove him from the line of succession. The British resident Alec Kirkbride often intervened on Talal's behalf, but strangely, it was because Talal was anti-British. As Kirkbride said, removing Talal from the line of succession would be seen by many as a Machiavellian plot on the part of the British government. It is important to keep in mind though that Jordan, like many countries in the region, depended on foreign aid. As Time magazine reported, Jordan depends almost entirely on a British subsidy of £7.5 million annually to run its government, and its British-trained Arab Legion of 10,000 men. So the rulers of Jordan often just had to oblige. Before his death, Abdullah had even discussed the possibility of uniting with Faisal II of Iraq to solve the issue. Yet the British insisted Talal remained the heir, even when he was receiving treatment for his mental illness. This was possibly schizophrenia, as he would often attack his own family and foreign guests. He was actually in treatment when his father was assassinated, and this left his brother Prince Naif as regent. There were some plans for Naif to take full power, so Talal returned despite never fully recovering. In some later episodes, he would even attack his own queen with a knife. Prime Minister Tawfiq Abu al-Huda called on Parliament to depose the king in 1952, believing he was planning on taking full power. Parliament quickly agreed, and they would crown his son Hussein as the new king of Jordan. Meanwhile, within Israel, many Arabs were left under martial law. There were further expulsions and the likes, raising the total number of Palestinians that fled to 700,000, in an event the Islamic world calls the Nakba. At the same time, the number of Jews grew as displaced Europeans moved there in huge numbers. It's estimated that between 1942 and 1952, a couple 100,000 migrated, mainly from Poland and Romania. They were then joined by tens of thousands from Muslim countries, where there were still around 1 million Jews in total. However, the exodus had already begun. In Turkey, a lot had already left because of the wealth tax and Thrace pogrom. Plus, Turkey was one nation that largely allowed emigration, whereas most Arab states banned it entirely, believing that it would only strengthen the new Jewish state. So between 1948 and 51, another 35,000 Jews left Turkey, nearly half of the total population. In Morocco, 20,000 Jews made the journey to Israel early on. Yet, like with many Turkish Jews, it was reported that the majority wanted to return home but never could. Then in 1948, in the Oujda region, Moroccans began to watch on as some Jews crossed the border into Algeria and then possibly going on to Palestine. Seeing these as possible soldiers in the war, the people rioted and killed a few dozen people. However, the French governor of the region, René Brunel, claimed that the Jews were to blame for inflaming tensions by leaving illegally, but still, more would leave in the 1950s. Real moves, though, were happening over in Iraq. There, Nouri al-Said said to the UN, "Severe measures should be taken against all Jews in Arab countries. There are more Jews in the Arab world outside of Palestine than there are in Palestine. It will breed interreligious prejudice and hatred." So, in his country, they dismissed Jews from the civil service, boycotted their businesses and the likes. One prominent Jewish businessman named Shafiq Adez was even executed in public before a crowd of thousands. This in turn forced many to flee, often aided by underground Zionist groups. Then a series of bombs went off in the Jewish quarters of Baghdad, prompting the Israelis to launch Operation Ezra and Nehemiah. This was essentially just an operation to airlift as many Jewish people out of the country. However, there is no consensus over who was to blame for the bombings, and many in fact blamed the underground Zionist movement, who possibly hoped to encourage mass migration. And there is actually a history of Israeli groups doing this. Like just a couple of years later, they were caught in Egypt trying to set off bombs. The plan was then to blame it on Egyptian nationalists and thus encourage mass migration, all as part of the Lavon affair. Regardless, 120,000, essentially all Iraqi Jews, left within a year. Sticking to Egypt though, they had recently had pogroms, and now their government was also more hostile to their native Jews as well. For instance, Nokrashi said to the British, all Jews were potential Zionists, and all Zionists were communists. Around a third of them left around 1948, and bombings then drove more to leave. In this case though, they were actually set off by the Muslim Brotherhood. As for Yemen, many of their Jews had already left, so they only had around 35,000 in 1947. Then anti-Semitic riots in Aden pushed more to leave, while the Israeli Operation Carpet brought in far more. This began in 1949, and within a year, they airlifted 50,000 Jewish people out of the country. However, over 1,000 Yemeni children that arrived in Israel mysteriously disappeared. This has led to widespread accusations of kidnapping, and more recently, even human experiments. But sticking on Yemen for a moment, as 1948 was a pivotal year for them. Imam Yahya had ruled the country for decades at this point, and he kept his nation isolated from the outside world. For instance, he famously said, "I would rather that my people and I remain poor and eat straw than let foreigners in." So it was only around this time that the country actually started producing their own currency. But there was a growing movement against him in the Free Yemeni movement. This began shortly after their loss against Saudi Arabia in 1934 and continued to grow thanks in part to the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt. Early leaders like the poet Muhammad Mahmud al-Zubairi had studied in Cairo and even met the group. Together they made plans on revolutionizing the country, which they deemed the most backwards in the Arab world. As such, they wrote a manifesto which included a return to a pure spirit of Islam, expansion of education, and stronger ties with other Muslim states. Obviously though, this all went against Yahya's isolationism. Yahya managed to arrest many members back in 1942, while even his son Ahmed bin Yahya supposedly said, "I pray to God I do not die before I colour my sword here with the blood of these modernists." However, there were still many tribal issues in the country as well. Ali Nasser al-Qadhi, for instance, led the Murad tribes, and he had long opposed Yahya, even clashing with government troops back in 1929. Well, now in 1948, he had joined the Free Yemeni movement, and they found a new figurehead in Abdallah al-Wazir, a former royal advisor and aristocrat. Al-Qadhi then assassinated Yahya in 1948, and the group placed al-Wazir on the throne. However, Ahmed bin Yahya rallied together tribes loyal to his family and marched on Sana'a. The city was captured and al-Wazir was beheaded. But in return for their support, the new king allowed his allied tribesmen to sack the city. Ahmad then continued down much the same path, keeping Yemen largely isolated, while also looking to expand into Aden and forming a greater Yemen.